Our next speaker is Claudio Vera Sanchez, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at Roosevelt University.
All right, good morning. How's it going? Good morning. All right. So again, thank you for the introduction. My name is Dr. Claudio Vera Sanchez. I'm an assistant professor at Roosevelt University in Chicago. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to Sac State University for allowing us to be here, and also for Consum's Community College. Community colleges always hold a really special place in my heart because I went to community college myself. So thank you for being here, all of you. So I want to talk about police violence and police legitimacy. I want to sort of reiterate some of what Dr. Swan said earlier in his remarks, that police officers are people too. And what that really entails is really understanding all of my research that I've done. I've talked to young people, I've talked to adults, police officers, and I've met many very good officers. Officers that were really willing to put their lives on the line for people, individual officers that really were willing to help folks, et cetera, et cetera. But I also, on the other hand, met the other kind of police officers, right? The other police officers that undermine the policing profession. So I want to be clear to folks that what I'm really going to be talking about is not individual police officers per se, but what I'm really going to be talking about is police institutions, a critique of policing institutions, and to a certain extent, to an understanding and a critique of American government. Sometimes some of my students say, Professor, it seems like you're anti-police, it seems like you're anti-government. And my response to my students is often, I am not. I'm actually pro-police, I'm actually pro-government. What I am anti is, I am anti-bad policing, I am anti-bad government, I am anti-bad public policy, which ultimately creates a situation where we have bad policing. What kind of bad policing? Well, allow me to first start off by playing a short video for all of you. And I'm sure some of you have already heard of this case, Terrence Crutcher, where this individual officers were called to the scene because there was a car in the middle of the road. Now, granted that some folks may argue, well, this is a dangerous situation, right? A car is in the middle of the road. But keep in mind that officers are not being called because there's a homicide. They're not being called to the scene because there's some type of really hard or harsh criminal activity. It's because there's a car on the side of the road. There are multiple reasons why there could be a car on the side of the road. How many of you have ever had your car break down? Half the students, when I was a student, I had my car break down all the time. So I completely empathize and understand, right? So again, it starts off with this car. So let's see what happens here.
It was the moments before 40-year-old Terrence Crutcher is shot and killed by a Tulsa police officer. From this dash cam video, and a police chopper.
He's got his hands up there for it now.
A national crisis, correct? What we have are things that appear to be happening over and over again. Now, granted that when we hear about some of these events, people think, well, you know, there's a lot of different circumstances. There are a lot of different things that happen in all these different scenarios. But there are also trends, disturbing trends, that I think are important to pay attention to. What kinds of trends? Well, allow me to talk about three of them. The first thing that we're seeing over and over again is that men of color appear to be killed by the police, right? That's one of the trends that we see over and over again. The second trend that we're seeing is that in many of these cases, the men appear to be unarmed. And I'll talk a little bit about to what extent they are unarmed. And last but not least, equally troubling, is that grand juries are unwilling to indict the officers, even when there's clear evidence of wrongdoing. Allow me to start with the first one. So first and foremost, we see over and over that it appears that a number of men are being killed. To what extent is this a problem in America? Well, when you look at FBI statistics in 2014, based on FBI data, anglers show that from 2005 to 2012, twice per week a black person was killed by an officer in the US. This is twice the rate of whites, so it seems like this is happening over and over again. And I'm sure many of you have seen this in the news, right? Can I have a show of hands of folks that have heard about some of these cases over and over, right? They appear to be happening over and over again. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the research and what the literature says in terms of some of these trends. When we do some of the empirical studies in the laboratory, do they appear to complement what we're seeing in terms of our interactions with the media and the things that are happening? And the answer to that is that they are. Allow me to explain. Correll et al. In 2001 conducted an experiment. They brought actually people to a laboratory, young people such as yourself, students in many cases, and they asked them to do something very simple. They said, look, you are going to play a video game. All you're going to do is shoot the person that has the gun. You have pictures of white folks and pictures of black folks. Some of them are holding a soda in their hand. Some of them are holding some cigarettes. Other folks are holding a gun. Very simple task. Is it? Yes, it is. What they found overwhelmingly is that the folks were more likely to shoot the unarmed black person than any of the other categories, which is consistent with what we're seeing in the media. In other words, the idea that implicit bias exists. Now, more interestingly, Payne et al. In 2001 replicated the study, but this time they only studied African Americans. And they also too found that African Americans were also more likely to shoot the unarmed black person. So researchers were asking themselves, what is going on here? And I've had some of my students have said, well, look, even African Americans have bias against themselves. And my response to that has been, think about it for a moment. Many of you, raise your hands if you grew up in this society. The majority of folks. Now, all of you, the majority of you, have been exposed to racialized images during your lives. In other words, America has a long-standing legacy, a long-standing political virus of racism in the U.S. Despite our best intentions, is it possible that you could walk away from a system such as this unscathed? Is it possible that no one in this room, despite our best intentions, has any bias toward any group of any time? Is that possible? What do you think? Probably not, right? So in other words, what we're seeing in terms of laboratory studies complement what we're seeing also on a national scale in terms of unarmed men of color that keep on dying over and over again. Now, why do I keep on reiterating this point about unarmed men? Well, because sometimes when people are seeing some of these images, and especially when you read the blogs, as long as a person has any kind of blemish in their record, all of a sudden that is no longer a worthy victim. As long as they've done something in their past, which again, many of us have done something bad in our past, right? Maybe not to the extent of murder or whatnot, but nevertheless. And so as long as this happens, we could vilify the individual. But what we find in the data, according to Shaney and Robertson in 2015, they report that 46% of the people that were being killed by the police did not have a gun on them. And again, I present this data because a lot of folks are going to ask, well, they probably had a gun, they were probably going to shoot the officer, et cetera, so the officer had to defend themselves. That is one of the most common sort of arguments to justify killings by the police. And last but not least, what we have are, again, grand juries unwilling to indict the officers, even again when there is compelling evidence. Eric Gardner in New York, he is being choked to death. You can see it on camera. Yes, for those folks, the guy was selling cigarettes, for crying out loud. And despite this evidence, the grand juries were unwilling to indict the officers. What does this say? Not necessarily only about that particular jury, but about all of us. What does that say about how much value we put on the lives of people of color? And that means all of us. That's not just a small, secluded group of jurors that are making these decisions. It reflects what American society thinks about when it comes to the lives and the value of people of color. So across the nation, needless to say, there have been people that have not been very happy about this. We have seen an extraordinary amount of efforts to try to bring awareness to these pressing issues. We see this in Ferguson, in Chicago, in New York. How many of you have heard about all these different protests going across the US? It is a national crisis, something that we have yet to solve. A long-standing problem with the police and with police institutions, despite the fact, again, that there are a lot of good officers out there. Across the nation, we see this over and over again, and this is consistent with Professor Blanco's presentation about the militarization of the police. The response, invariably in many of these cases, is a militarized response against the mostly peaceful protesters who are angry, dissatisfied, angry about what? Again, number of black people being killed and people of color, folks are unarmed, and then no justice being served. So what else would you expect out of folks other than this, right? So again, over and over again, right, militarized responses. However, on the other hand, we have also seen some of these protesters have not all entirely been peaceful, correct? We have also seen, on the other hand, that some folks have used this as an opportunity to express their frustration in a number of different ways. Looting, throwing rocks at police, et cetera, and many folks, rightfully so, ask the question, what does that have to do with justice? What does throwing things at police officers have to do with serving justice for Michael Brown or Eric Gardner or Freddie Gray or all these folks? What does walking in and burning things have to do with really bringing national consciousness about this problem? What does stealing a 40 ounce of malt liquor from a liquor store have to do with helping aid this particular cause? So you see this over and over again, right? Vandalizing cars, burning cars, you name it, you've seen this. Yes, you've seen all these images over and over again. Now, what's important to note here is the historical resemblance of the 1960s. In the 1960s, too, again, the majority of folks were not around. In the 1960s, you had similar things going on. Riots, burning, looting, all these things were happening. And to this, even Martin Luther King in 1967, the year prior to his death, was asked to speak about this. What do you think about all these folks who are looting, who are creating mayhem? Could you please respond in terms of what you think about these folks? About these thugs, about these miscreants and whatnot, right? How the media generally describe folks. And he said the following, okay? This is really, really fascinating. He responded in 1967 by quoting the famous French novelist Victor Hugo. How many of you have heard of Victor Hugo, right? Very, very famous French novelist. And he quoted, Dr. King quoted him saying, quote unquote, "If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness." But he went on to explain what he meant. King went on, "The policymakers of American society have caused the darkness. They created discrimination. They created slums. They perpetuate unemployment and poverty. It is uncontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes." Is he saying that it's a good thing that people are burning stuff down? Absolutely not, right? It is uncontestable and deplorable that people are doing these things. Similarly to what's happening today, it is uncontestable and deplorable that people are throwing rocks at a police officer that has nothing to do with the problem. However, they are derivative crimes. Has anyone ever heard of the word derivative? For those who may not know, it means that it originates from somewhere else. They are born of the greater crimes of American society. So what you're seeing here in terms of these riots and protests and things that are happening, they originate from something else, from frustration, from disenchantment, from anger against the system, which leads to the main concept by my presentation, legitimacy. What happens when we lose confidence in the system of policing? What happens when we lose confidence in our government? So these are the two domains that I'm going to be focusing: American government and, by the same token, policing. Why am I focusing on American government? Well, first and foremost, I have always found American government to be highly fascinating. Why? Well, first and foremost, I'm a Mexican immigrant, right? To a Mexican immigrant who has lived in Mexico and sees the American system, it seems fascinating in terms of how it operates. It works in some ways better than in other countries, and in some other countries, by comparison, a lot worse. So again, I've always been fascinated by American government, what it means, and what it means for people to lose confidence in that system, lose confidence in policing and government. Again, the idea of legitimacy. When people lose confidence in a system, then again, you're going to see similar things that we've been seeing in major cities, Ferguson, New York, Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. Again, people are angry. It is understandable that they would break stuff if they're angry. It is understandable to a certain extent. Not justifiable, but understandable. I want to for us to start thinking about government. And the first question I want to pose is just in terms of raising your hand of whether or not you think this may be true or not. This is also consistent with Professor Blanco's idea in terms of a democracy and government and things of that type. But I want to ask just a central question. Do you think the framers of the U.S. Constitution would have trusted the police to possess extraordinary power? Now, let me clarify this for a moment. A very important criminologist by the name of Fife in 1998 said this. He said, the police have more power in their holster than the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by their ability to use deadly force without having to invoke upon a prolonged legal process. Think about that for a moment. Think about how much power we're talking about. Now, just a raise of hands, how many of you do you think the framers of the Constitutions would have trusted, just a show of hands, the police to have this much power? A number of folks. A couple here and there. Depending on the audience, sometimes they have, standing room only agreeing, other folks disagree. Now, obviously, we can't ask the framers of the Constitution, but we can read from their works, from the Declaration of Independence, from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, from the Federalist Papers. We can have an idea of how they viewed government and what this means in terms of policing. So please bear with me. I'm going to talk about first one of the main architects of some of these documents, Thomas Jefferson. And this is what he said in 1778. Experience has shown that even under the best forms of government, those entrusted with power have, in time and by slow operations, perverted it into tyranny. Second quotation that is often attributed to Jefferson. There are two enemies of the people. The two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution, so the second will not become the legalized version of the first. Now, you may be asking yourselves, well, if the framers of the Constitution were so fearful of government, why did they create government in the first place? And why were they so fearful of government? Well, allow me to give a little bit of historical context, and please bear with me. I will tie it to policing, I promise, right? Situate this back to 1776. They are under the rule of King George III. Yes, for those of you who have paid attention in some of the history classes. Now, was King George III a good guy or a bad guy? Bad guy. He was a tyrant, right? He would execute people without due process. He would incarcerate people without due process. He would take your stuff because he's the king, yes? Over and over again. In addition to this, the framers of the Constitution had a commanding knowledge of world history, Greek history, Roman history, and philosophy, especially from the time of Enlightenment. How do we know this? Because our government is directly related to some of the philosophical works that perhaps some folks sleep through in some of the philosophy classes, yes? I see some folks smiling. Nevertheless, these philosophical works became the foundation for the American Constitution, for the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and many of these other very important documents. Again, a very strong commanding knowledge of this. Allow me to give you an example. In Plato's Republic, and I'll tell you what they concluded in a moment. In Plato's Republic, there's a story called The Ring of Gyges. How many of you have read Plato's Republic? A number of folks. How many of you are trying to avoid Plato's Republic? A number of folks, yes. Plato's Republic, the story, right? It's an allegory. The Ring of Gyges. Gyges is the shepherd that's walking along the pasture one day and finds this cave. And when he goes into the cave, he finds this corpse that has a ring on it. Keep in mind that this is an allegory. And so when he pries the ring off, he pulls it really hard, finally takes it off, puts it on. When he puts the ring on, he finds that he can become invisible. Again, it's an allegory. Now Socrates asks, what will Gyges do? Will he use that ring for good or will he use that ring for evil? Needless to say, guys, those woeful things. He kills the king, seduces the queen, becomes the king of Lydia. In other words, the framers of the Constitution, based on their experiences with King George III, their commanding knowledge of history, philosophy, concluded two things. Number one, men cannot be trusted with power. Number two, we have to institute government to protect us from men who have power. Those are the two main conclusions that they came up with. Now think about this as it relates to the police, okay? What they have trusted this small group of men, as well trained as they are, and many of them are very well trained, they have very good intentions, what they have trusted them to have that amount of power. So I want to start, again, we're still talking about government, and again, I promise I will tie it more closely to policing in a moment. By first and foremost, going back for a moment to think about whether or not people have the right to express their frustration against the system of policing and government they view as being illegitimate. This is always salient for me as, again, Mexican immigrant from Mexico. If you protest against the police in Mexico, what do you think is going to happen to you? You're going to be found by a ditch the next day, most likely, right? Our country is different in that we have documents, guiding principles, aren't always necessarily perfectly implemented. We know that for sure. But nevertheless, these are the secret documents that guide us over and over again, and that we insist guide us because they are timeless in what they say. Allow me to explain. The majority of you have read this, and people across the world have read this. Where does it come from? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. How many of you have heard that before? All of us. However, for a lot of people, they don't closely pay attention to the language. In other words, it is easy to grow up in American society where this becomes so hegemonic that you stop thinking about how special and precious this is. Let's say we go to a different part of India where they still practice certain type of caste systems. How many of you have heard of the untouchables, okay? And caste systems in India? If you go tell them that everyone is created equal, they will look at you like you've lost your mind. Yes? Because not any of all these principles that we're talking about are necessarily universal or axiomatic across all different cultures. But they go on. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I will speak about how these relate to policing in a moment. Okay? However, what happens when a system of policing or a system of government undermines these very important principles? Think about policing. What happens when police undermine life? What happens when police undermine liberty? What happens when they undermine the pursuit of happiness? Well, the framers of the Constitution gave us some guidance in terms of what we should do in those situations. They said, when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. They go on. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to do what? Throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. Now, for those of you who may not necessarily know what the word duty means, it's an obligation, yes? That is the dictionary definition. Not only is it your right, it is your obligation. It is not for you to leave it for someone else to fix the issue. A lot of folks in contemporary society believe that to truly be an American is to blindly accept what government does, to blindly accept what police does, to adopt a hyper-nationalistic view of American society and to just allow government to do whatever it wants. That is far from what the framers of the Constitution articulated in some of their most famous writings. So if the framers of the Constitution were so distrustful of government, again, why create one? Okay? They said the following: to secure the rights that we've been talking about, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is also very different from other societies, class. When you look at totalitarian governments, when you look at dictatorships, the people are altogether absent from that process, correct? You may not always like the decision, just like our new president-elect. A lot of folks are unhappy about that, correct? But nevertheless, it was achieved through a democratic process, was it not? Correct? So again, this is unique in this society, that you have a change of power from one group of people to another, and there is no major revolt, other than the protests that we're seeing across the nation. But in other countries, there would be a major revolt. Now, this becomes really important here because this relates very strong to the police. In the Constitution, the reason our government is designed the way it is because the framers of the Constitution adopted the ideas of John Locke that are called the ideas of the social contract. How many of you have ever heard of the social contract, perhaps in some of your philosophy classes? The social contract is this idea that was created by John Locke. John Locke basically said in a nutshell, again, I'm not going to go on and on about it, but he said, look, if you leave them to their own devices, the nature of man or the nature of things, life will be short, brutish, poor. It will not be very good. Why? Because if you leave men to their own devices, they will always choose the wrong thing. If you leave men to their own devices, they will have unlimited freedoms to do bad things as well. The right to kill, the right to plunder, the right to rape. You would have chaos in society. In order to avoid this, men enter a social contract with either some sovereign power or an assembly or group of people that establish political and legal order, and that creates a system where you give up some of your freedoms, as Professor Blanco pointed out, but in turn, the government provides protection. This becomes really important because this exists in a democratic society. It doesn't exist, again, in a totalitarian regime. So John Locke, in the social contract, basically said, we give up some of our freedoms, right? The freedom to do unlimited number of things, right? As he pointed out, plunge, pillage, do all these different things, in exchange for government protections of certain things. What kinds are they protecting? What kinds of things? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which later on came to be understood as property, okay? If you want to understand what exactly they mean by the pursuit of happiness. Now, obviously government can't be at every single place at every single time. They cannot possibly be ubiquitous, omnipresent. So the mechanism by which that protection takes place in contemporary society is through the mechanism of the police. In American society, in this democratic society, police officers have what are called manifest functions. How many of you have heard of the word manifest before? Manifest functions. It's a clear and obvious function. Allow me to give you an example. A manifest function of a college professor is to teach classes and do research and grade papers. Yes? A professor may not like reading research papers, but nevertheless, that's one of the functions. A professor that doesn't teach or do research isn't really a college professor. He might be something else. He might be a researcher, something else. So those are the manifest functions. Accordingly, police also have manifest functions under the social contract. Again, we give up some of our rights and government offers us protection. So now you understand where the words protect and serve come from in the police cars, yes? We're not just talking about protecting things randomly. No, we're talking about protecting our very cherished things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a democratic society, as I pointed out, police have obvious functions. few people would disagree with these. Number one, to apply the law fairly and justly. We expect that of our police officers, do we not? Yes? And secondly, to protect and serve. And again, what are we talking about in terms of protect and serve? Going back to these basic principles. Okay? So the question that I've always been interested in is what happens when the police appear to undermine these manifest functions by some of the things that keep on happening over and over and over again across the nation. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about what this means. So first and foremost, this is just a visual representation of the social contract. And as you see here, you have the people who give up power, and in turn, the government protects their rights. However, when the government, as a starting point here, misuses their power, then the people have the right to overthrow or replace it. This is a unique type of government. This is not universal across all societies, guys. And again, as a Mexican immigrant, I'm always keenly aware of this. When I've conducted research, I've conducted research in Oakland, California, and Chicago primarily. And I've talked to young people, I've talked to older residents, we've done focus groups, randomized surveys, we talked to police, I've done ride-alongs with officers. If you have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer some of those. And we have come to general conclusions based on the data, certain parameters and things happening over and over again. When you look at the manifest functions of the police, it appears that the police often, in certain circumstances, violate those manifest functions. And the reason I say certain circumstances is because when you walk into Palo Alto, California, or a nice, really nice suburb in a certain part of Chicago, such as Naperville, you don't see what I'm talking about. And so people have the impression that all policing is good because they're not experiencing those things on a first-hand basis. But when we actually speak to Oakland residents who live in the poorest, marginalized areas, when we speak to folks in the south side and west side of Chicago, then you see these stories emerge over and over again. First and foremost, when we talk about the manifest function of enforcing the law fairly and justly, to a lot of people, they don't believe that the police enforce the law fairly and justly. Now, this is not always the fault of police officers. I want to be very clear about this. For example, in Arizona, there is a law called SB 1070. SB 1070 mandates that police officers have to stop people who they reasonably believe looks like an immigrant. Many police officers are against SB 1070, but nevertheless, they are forced to enforce those policies. So in other words, when we're thinking about the violation of manifest functions, this is poor public policy, terrible, insidious public policy. The war on drugs that some of my colleagues already spoke about, terrible policy. Why? Well, because its enforcement happens primarily in black and brown communities. Michelle Alexander, in her famous work, The New Jim Crow, elucidates this point, and she says, when you look at national surveys and you ask people of different racial groups, African Americans, whites, etc., do you use drugs? You see comparable rates of drug use, and in some cases, it's actually a little bit higher for whites. However, when you look at the enforcement of drug policies, you see that those people that are most likely to end up arrested, incarcerated, etc., are people of color. Now she forces the question, what would happen if instead of sending all these special police units and enforcing these policies in barrios and ghettos, we went to a university? We came to this college. We went to Sacramento State. We went to UC Berkeley and sent paramilitary specialized units. Do you think that they would find drugs on those Berkeley students? Class? I mean, not class, but, audience? Do you think they would find drugs? Absolutely. Absolutely they would find stuff on them. But that's not how we police. So again, terrible public policy. What we found in Oakland, California, we also found that the police appear to be an apparatus of racial and economic segregation. And this, I found to be the case also in the city of Chicago. What does this mean? Well, keep in mind that after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it became illegal to have segregation de facto, but nevertheless, we still have it today. You see some communities are really nice and beautiful, correct? And some other communities that seem to have no hope whatsoever. Well, what we found in Oakland, California, is that sometimes when indigent residents went into the better parts of Oakland, California, the police officers would stop them, they would arrest them, they would harass them, they would throw them against a police car. All these things kept on happening over and over again. Very similar to what I found in Chicago in some of the gentrified neighborhoods. So in other words, we have different examples that lead us to believe that one of the manifest functions, which is to enforce the law fairly and justly, not always to the fault of individual police officers, becomes violated. Secondly, and this becomes really important to our discussion when we're thinking about police violence, is this idea of protect and serve. The residents in Oakland, California unequivocally referred to the police as a gang without us prompting them to think of the police as a gang. In Chicago, they also told me that they believed that the police were a gang. Why did they believe this? Because some of the things that they were experiencing themselves and also vicarious experiences. Things that they heard about in the news, that they heard from their neighbors, things that they heard about from their friends, some of the things that their children themselves were experiencing. For example, in the city of Chicago, they have something called wolf packs. A wolf pack is a group of special units, and I did ride-alongs with special units. They would drive off to a corner, they would pull everyone over, chain them to the fences, pat and search them, didn't find anything, go off to the next corner, chain everyone to the fences, search them, didn't find, a cat and mouse game all day long. Think about all the civil rights violations, right? Last week, I did a presentation very similar to this in Louisiana, and one of the officers in New Orleans said to me, you know, I was a police officer in Chicago, and I never saw the chaining to the fence that you're referring to. You know, he worked in the 11th district, and I did some of my ride-alongs in the 11th district and 25th district. And I said to the police officer, because I respect police officers, I said, you know, I completely appreciate your perspective, and I completely understand. However, what I found was actually quite tame and moderate in comparison to what some of the courts found these special units to be responsible for. In 2007, the same year I conducted some of those ride-alongs, the Chicago police, by independent courts, was found to be guilty, the special units, of bribery, extortion, kidnapping, falsifying evidence, very similar to the crash unit in Los Angeles, very similar to the Oakland riders in Oakland, California. So although I am alarmed as you are by the notion that people are being chained to the fences, I didn't find any shootings of anything of that type. What I found was moderate, but nevertheless, a violation of the primary functions that the police have. So in closing, I want to highlight again, when I conducted many ride-alongs with police officers and did interviews, I found many good officers, many excellent officers that wanted to serve their communities. This is not about individual officers. This is about institutions that exist in the US. The institution of policing, institution of bad public policy, which again creates bad policing as I see it. So, in closing, to highlight what I've already stated, when racial and economic segregation and other unfair laws are supported by police, the law becomes nothing more than an arbitrary rule. People stop believing in the law. So in other words, if you're wondering why people are breaking stuff in Ferguson and burning stuff, they have lost in confidence in the rule of law. To them, the rule of law means nothing because the law doesn't appear to serve them in a positive way. And last but not least, what they're experiencing in terms of police violence also undermines police legitimacy. By men of color who are unarmed, that are continuously killed by the police over and over and over, and there appears to be very little justice, this only helps to further undermine the profession of policing. Thank you so much for your time.
We'll now hear formal comments from Sanjay Marwah, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice, California State University, East Bay, Abigail Blanco, Assistant Professor of Economics, University of Tampa, and Jody Johnson of Rock Solid Advisement. Sanjay, would you like to start us off?
Thank you. Enjoyed your presentation very much. I have one comment to make and perhaps a question to ask of yourself, but really for the audience as well. Patrick O'Hara at John Jay talks about organizational failures in policing, and I think your presentation also possibly links closely with that in terms of police leadership who has really failed policing in terms of not calling out instances of obviously a growing trend that we've seen, but a historical trend as well. So my question and comment really also, but more so of a comment, is what do you think police leadership can do to address it? Because ultimately they're the ones who probably have the most ability to influence, to change. In some ways, legitimacy is in the eye of the beholder, and police leadership doesn't really think policing as its practice is a problem. So, I think that raises a lot of questions as well. And the second, related, in terms of looking at the framers of the Constitution, as you indicated, a system, I grew up outside of the United States as well, in the Philippines, and I didn't really appreciate the form of government until I got to here, to the United States, a long time ago, aging myself. But nonetheless, what I saw also was there was democracy, as we know, but there's also, unfortunately, the right to bear arms and other individual rights, or have been framed as individual rights more recently, that also put the United States in danger, or dangers. And so I guess legitimacy, again, relating back to my earlier comment, is in the eye of the beholder. And unfortunately, if the government, and we have multiple governments, and that's changed since the framers of the Constitution knew the United States, how can they really, how can the public really challenge legitimacy? And using violence, as we've seen, unfortunately, in both presentations, seems to be the best solution.
So, thank you for your comments, Professor Sanjay. So first and foremost, in terms of organizational factors, this is something that is often overlooked by the general public, partly because it's not the sexy part of policing, right? When you look at a African American or a person of color and a white officer doing the shooting, we think we have solved the problem. It's just racism, we need to get rid of it. Let's change, the race of the officer, which again, when you look at the data, it doesn't seem to have a lot of effect. Let's subject officers to a lot of sensitivity training. Let's put police cameras, but all of these efforts are met with equivocal results. But the point about organizational factors is extremely, extremely important. When I did ride-alongs with police officers in these districts, I remember I walked into one of the gang officers, and there was a sign on the wall, okay? This is not where the general public can see, and it said, "Quality comes before quantity only in the dictionary, so go get some heads." Now think about that for a moment. To a new recruit that walks into a police department that has good intentions, from the first day, they already understand what the organizational values are. All of you in your jobs are going to do things that you believe are going to help you succeed in terms of promotion, et cetera, et cetera. It became clear to me that police organizations did not care about the quality of arrest, that is the arrest that would end up in a conviction, but rather they cared about the numerical amount of arrest because they used that as a barometer for how efficient their performance was as police officers. So if you wanted to make detective, you better have a lot of arrests under your belt. And this was clear across the line. They also had this technological system called CompStat. CompStat was used to find where the hot spots are in the neighborhoods. So naturally, if you see that there's a lot of crime going on in a neighborhood, well, you send police officers to that particular spot. Reasonable sort of policy implications. However, police officers will saturate those areas, and after a couple of weeks, there was no more crime in those neighborhoods, in those areas. Why? Because the crime became displaced to other parts of the neighborhood or other factors. So now the higher administrators came along and said, hey, are police officers goofing off Are they fooling around? How come there are no arrests in those areas? And now they put an extraordinary amount of pressure on the watch commanders, and the watch commanders on the police officers, and the police officers are now arresting people for anything, a small roach of marijuana, because now they have an incredible amount of pressure. So organizational factors are the non-sexy part of policing, but nevertheless create a lot of aggressive policing, an unfortunate number of arrests, et cetera, et cetera. That answered part of your question.
Abby?
So a few different comments. One thing that people always say is the few bad apples argument. And my normal rebuttal to that is, well, you know, few bad apples will spoil the entire cart of apples. I agree, it's an institutional issue. I wanted to touch on a couple of the three trends that you mentioned. So men of color being killed by police, at least a large portion of these being unarmed, and then the fact that grand juries are unwilling to indict. I think the indictment point, it's important to bring up the fact that police and military are kind of the few sacred cows that exist in American society. And so to criticize members of the police department, to criticize members of the US military, will very quickly, and this is the voice of experience talking, get you labeled as being un-American, get you labeled as being anti-establishment and all of these other things. And so I think that there is a general reluctance of people to openly question and to say that, yes, you, while performing this remarkably difficult job, are going to be subjected to certain standards. I think that people are reluctant to do that. There was something that was interesting that you brought up in terms of the experiments where they found that African Americans were just as likely to shoot black suspects as opposed to white suspects. And economics, I think, can really help us understand why some of that might occur. So you can think of different reasons why minorities might be overrepresented in the criminal justice system. But the fact that that is the case, and in fact minorities are far statistically overrepresented in all levels of the US criminal justice system, is that this sets up a scenario in which police officers can rationally expect to arrest more people of color. It doesn't mean that they're doing so correctly, but basically if they walk into a situation, what do they know? They know the statistics. They know that blacks, Hispanics are more likely to be arrested, jailed, and incarcerated, and so they're more likely to respond potentially in a disproportionately aggressive way. And so the implication of that, which is something that you touched on, is that if that's what's going on, and I'm not saying that racism is not a component, because I think that certainly some of that is absolutely there, but if it's this more like rational choice kind of a situation, then the proposals on the table to fix things with sensitivity training are just completely like throwing, bad policy after bad policy, ultimately not going to fix the underlying issue. And then the third point that you made, the third point, and then talking about the derivative crime. It reminds me of the work of an economist named Walter Williams, and I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he wrote a very good book that's called Race and Economics. And Williams grew up in the projects in Philadelphia. He talks about his experience of what it's like to grow up in the projects in Philly in the 1950s and in the 1960s, what his family structure looked like, and basically the point that he makes is, again, this institutional kind of point. So what he argues is that things like the welfare state have effectively eroded some really important, pillars in the black community, which he points as being a big underlying problem for a lot of the things happening now.
So I just want to comment briefly on this idea of the rotten apples, right? Philip Zimbardo also talks about this, and he says that there's no such thing as a rotten apple, only a rotten barrel. And if you place any of us in that rotten barrel, will come out a rotten apple. So in other words, if you place any of us in a set of circumstances that propel a certain kind of behavior, we're likely to do very similar things. How does this relate to policing? Ronald Weitzer in 2000 wrote an article called Blue Cop, Black Cop. And what he found is that actually African-American officers tended to be tougher towards the suspects than the white officers. And he argued in that particular article that African American officers in some instances were overcompensating to the partners by appearing impartial and in turn being actually more aggressive. So when you look at the data, whether or not hiring more black officers or Latino officers of any other race will remedy the problem, you find mixed results. Freddie Gray, who died in Baltimore, that was primarily officers of color. In Chicago, 30% of the force is African American and Latino. So there's something deeper that we need to fix than just changing the race of the officer or subjecting folks to sensitivity training. Thank you.
Definitely appreciate us even having the space to have these type of conversations. I think these conversations are very few. Mm-hmm. And part of the legitimacy conversation has got to include the legal system, I believe. You brought up a couple of points about derivative crimes and the no indictment pieces. How, and this is a question to you, how do you think society will be affected as more and more of these no indictments turn into civil matters where substantial amounts are being awarded based upon civil liability being assessed? Like, does anybody know what civil liability means? It means that you're accepting fault in the death of somebody else. And just a couple of numbers, the city of Cleveland, because I think we brought up Tamir Rice, awarded the family $6 million. $6 million they felt they were at fault, but no indictment. How do we continue to allow situations where there's a substantial loss of life is the top and bottom line, where we accept or they accept fault, but there is no criminal punishment? Chicago had a similar situation with Laquan McDonald. Family awarded $5 million. Freddie Gray's family was awarded $6.4 million. No indictments. So to the legitimacy piece, where is the disconnect between criminal ownership and liability if we're assessing and saying that these folks are at fault? And the telling of that is, our second question is, we're in a room full of folks that are being taught. Mm-hmm. As educators, how do we start making sure that we educate on this history? Because this is their history now. Mm-hmm. We look in the history books and periods of time, like this is their history. I think you said that professors who don't teach or research are not college professors. So as we're teaching and researching these issues, how do we make sure that it comes to the forefront of this is an issue? So to you, how does that impact these civil cases, like these determinations that somebody is at fault but we can't indict? How does that impact you as an educator when you step into a classroom? These are all students. So how do you approach that?
So first and foremost, you bring up a really important point, right? There's a difference between criminal law and civil law, right? In criminal law, there might be charges such as, you're going to go to jail, prison, a number of different things. In civil case, for the most part, there's money awarded. You're not, for the most part, you might go to jail, it depends, but you're most likely not, okay? So I think this is an important question because the question is whether or not the people, all of you, all of us, will be satisfied with this. Will they be satisfied and said, well, some justice was served, but not all, or no, we're not happy with this. Yes, we got some money, but we're still losing lives, and we're gonna continue to lose lives because nothing is being done to reform the system to the extent that we could actually fix this. Now, going back to your second piece about teaching and engaging and whatnot, I think it's very important. A lot of universities call it different things, but service learning, transformative learning, those are things that I try to do with my students in terms of let's do something about this. What do you think is the appropriate channel? What do you think we should do now? And there's a number of different things that you can do with students that will demonstrate, that you're engaged and want to solve some of these problems, not just listen to them passively. It's important questions.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Please,
Okay.
Jody.
and a follow-up to kind of wrap it back around. Bringing it back to the derivative crimes, I read this morning that there was another killing of an officer. And I think in your presentation you explained how when the government isn't working, we as democratic participants in that government have the right to replace or remove. Do you feel as if the derivative crimes, again, crimes that originate from something else, are these justifiable killings?
Say that one more time.
Are they justifiable?
Are the killings of officers justified?
Not the killing. Well, yes. I mean, we'll call it what it is. An elephant in the room. And from the frame of derivative crimes, meaning instant after instant after instant of unarmed, even minor, like Tamir Rice is 12, is the byproduct of that justifiable as is occurring now?
I wouldn't say justifiable, I would say understandable. When you see a young kid such as Tamir Rice, for those of you who may not know much about this case, 12-year-old, in a park, basically has a toy gun, officers come to the scene, he's just playing around with the thing, points it, they shoot the kid, kill him. Now, think about you being parents for a moment, and think about losing your child, and think about you walk into the police station and the officers there say, well, we're really sorry. It's just that the officer was really afraid for their life. And then when we told the kid to put the gun down, they didn't. They failed to pay attention. They failed to follow instructions. Those are generally the two arguments that are often presented for why officers who kill people are justified to a certain extent. So I could understand the frustration and the anger and the resentment that people feel that eventually leads to unfortunate circumstances. And this is not the only time that officers are being killed. There have been other instances and will probably happen again, unfortunately. And again, I do believe they're derivative. They stem from these larger things that we haven't fixed and will probably continue to happen over and over again until we pay serious attention to this.
We'll now open the floor up for questions. We'll have 2 mics, one running up each aisle.
I kind of want to piggyback on what Jody said about it being that, is it justifiable for police killing, for people to kill the police? I feel that they're kind of like, you talked about them being angry for the rioting and burning up stuff. I feel like that's an act of war. Like, they're giving them a message that we're not scared of you, so if you want war, we're going to give you war. And I feel like you can't justify killing a 12-year-old boy because he had a BB gun and you were scared for your life. How could you die from a BB gun? A BB gun has fake pellets in it. You can't die from it. So for you to feel like that you were scared for your life and you killed an innocent child, and try to justify it as it being, oh, he didn't put it down, he wasn't listening, so that was our only option. There's other options of it. Dude who killed all the black people in that church, y'all walked him out freely. Black people can't even be walked out like that. We're killed, shot right there. And it's just like, you can't, there's no justifying nothing. Like, you should, as for it being that the courts has, when they do their trials, they're not giving people time. It's like, why? Like, you can't justify that killing those people are good.
That's an excellent question. I actually want to respond with some of the online comments. I meant to present some of these, but in the sake of time, some people unfortunately feel that in certain circumstances, these things, the killing of folks, people of color, are justified. Let me read one online quotation, and this sounds ridiculous to the majority of us, but nevertheless, a lot of folks believe this. One comment said to the death of Michael Brown, Officer Darren Wilson shot his gun in self-defense, and the killing of Michael Brown is a justifiable homicide. The blacks are lying, as they can usually be depended upon to do. So you can see very clearly that we have a nation divided when it comes to these issues. What seems very crystal clear to some of us in terms of social justice and the things that must be done in order to reform what's happening in some of our communities, to another subset of groups of people, I don't want to say Trump supporters, but maybe some of them, to them, this is not always a clear-cut issue. They don't have the same value they don't value, they don't place the same amount of value on these folks' lives because they justify what's happening under the guise that since folks, Michael Brown, prior to him being stopped by Officer Darren Wilson, was shoplifting or something of the type. Because of the shoplifting, all of a sudden he's a criminal and he deserves to die. Obviously, we know how ridiculous this sounds from a moral standpoint, but nevertheless, these are the justifications that are used by subsets of the population to justify what some officers are doing. Excellent, excellent comment.
So I noticed this background topic of what about the legitimacy for civilians using force, either in the rioting or just using force in general because it's effective against the government or against the police officers. And so my question is, can we reasonably argue against the legitimacy of the general use of high-level aggressive response, particularly militarization, those responses, if we legitimize the use of force by civilians against the government? If we want them to tone it down, how can we legitimize that argument if we ratchet it up? Thank you.
It's first of all, thank you for your question. It's interesting that was proposed. It's something I have conversations with my partner all the time. The power against power, force against force, violence against violence. And I think we always come to the terms of agreeing to disagree, because in order to spark change, in order to put change in motion, two forces have to come in contact, in collide, in conflict. I don't think that there is a necessary legitimizing or saying, hey, if we ratchet it up, you guys should tone it down. I don't think there's equatable at this point, just because they've already ratcheted it up. I think if you're at an even kill and able to come to a table when both sides are doing something at the same accord, it's a different type of conversation. But when one side is using force and the other side is saying, should we or could we or shall we, there's always going to be that constant struggle, because force has to be combated with force. There's no change otherwise.
I just want to respond really quickly that your question reminds me of the 1960s and how folks felt at some point in history that nothing was going to change in terms of de facto segregation, Jim Crow laws, and things of that type. So sometimes folks get really discouraged because of the problems that we see seem to be really nebulous and overwhelming, and how do we fix this, right? But consistent with the comments that you made, we live in a society, we could actually insist from our officials, either the police, government officials, and whatnot, to be better. In any other society, we would already have been shot by the police by even having this conversation that we're having in this room. So I want to say that similarly to what happened in the 1960s, change must come, but at some point, there has to be some conflict. That doesn't necessarily need to be violent conflict, but at some point, there has to be some confrontation of some type, or insistence that government, that police are better than they currently are. Excellent question.
I'll piggyback on that a little bit, because one thing that I think you're seeing now, and I think that one of the things, you can't talk about criminal justice reform in any meaningful way without talking about serious changes to U.S. drug policy, just hands down, without question. Especially if you want to talk about issues of race in policing, then the war on drugs is absolutely a place that is necessary to start. One thing that I've seen, which makes me kind of optimistic in some ways, is the direction of marijuana policy, because it's seeming to go the way of alcohol prohibition. So as you guys probably know, alcohol was banned by a constitutional amendment in the early 1900s, and then ultimately this amendment was repealed. Same kind of thing you see with the war on drugs. Good intentions, shockingly, don't always mean good outcomes. But basically what you had with alcohol prohibition was you had states that just ultimately said that we're not going to enforce this. And so they just they started to do exactly what you're doing now with some drug policies. People are saying things that this doesn't make sense, we're not enforcing it. And when you start to decriminalize these things that have led to mass incarceration, have led to a lot of people with criminal records, which, by the way, has implications for not just employment, but things like grants for education and stuff like that. And so that makes me optimistic. That is an example of something coming head to head in a way that is not necessarily violent, but of people showing up in the voting booth and saying, yeah, you know what, if people want to smoke weed, let them smoke weed. We're no longer going to criminalize this particular behavior. And so I think that you can look at this in a variety of different ways, not just by looking at it in terms of, of a clash necessarily being a physical one. It's a great question.
If I could just make one comment. I try to ask that same question to Dr. Sanchez in terms of should force or violence be used, and that's what struck me again, as I mentioned, when I first came to the United States, how different it was, and it's obviously, as all the panelists have said, and our speaker has said, the history of the war on drugs especially is very telling in the United States. On the other hand, I do think we've moved into the war on terror, which in fact is going to militarize even more and divide our country even more and probably lead to more violence being used. Interestingly enough, it's who's going to be perpetuating the violence is actually the government itself. If you look all across the globe, the United States government is the largest arms dealer. So it's not surprising that violence is being used as well. Unfortunately, it's very difficult because the legal system, as indicated before, is really the culprit, or legal systems, plural. And that's really where our attention should be, not just with the police.
So my mom is from the South, and she remembers desegregation, and she received a lot of abuses by her fellow classmates. And we were just talking about it this morning, and she was saying that the problem was that a lot of the students were taught to do that by their parents. So when I think about police, I think it's possible for individuals to come into the police force with preconceived ideas and notions and prejudices and biases. So why isn't there a conversation about maybe a universal type of training where they all go to a particular facility and then they're deployed back into their communities where they interact in that way? I mean, I don't know for sure like how it would work, but I'm thinking, why isn't there like a conversation about that, like how they're being taught to do their jobs?
I believe our speakers touched upon this earlier about training and the ineffectiveness of the tactics we're using. Part of the problem with universal training is you can't train somebody to be from a particular community, and most law enforcement officers are policing communities that they're not from. You can't teach somebody about the circumstances of folks in a community to the point to where they understand or even care. So in order to have a universal form of training, I think it would have to include folks being from that particular community in those trainings and actually in law enforcement, because now they understand the ebbs and flows of that community a lot better than a book can teach you. That's pretty much essentially what it would be, a book teaching you how to deal with particular people not authored by those particular people. That's just my standpoint on that.
I just want to comment quickly. I think that's an excellent question. I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King, who once said, the law can make a man love me, but it could stop him from killing me. So in other words, what I take from that is that you can't easily change people's mindsets. Let's say we exposed all of us here to sensitivity training. We can't easily change what's in people's hearts. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can't put laws and policies in place that prevent us from exercising to a large extent what's in our hearts. So in other words, my strategy has always been to change the organizational strategies to, because again, there's people that are, have biases about this, have biases about that. And I don't think police officers are the only ones that possess those biases. I think all of us do. Again, we are exposed to so many negative things over and over again about people of color all the time. Look at the media. Over and over you see, stories of, Latinos and blacks engaged in crime. How could you not at some point become indoctrinated with that? How do you desensitize yourself to that? How do you retrain that? It's very, very difficult. So my approach has always been, in terms of changing the organizational strategies, perhaps because I'm not convinced that we could change what's in people's hearts. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
We are out of time for this session. Fortunately, there is more of the program. Please join me in thanking our speaker and panelists.